Many times I was asked on all different levels from chess players if I can recommend to them some opening variations that they can play for today's game or tomorrow's game they're going to play in a tournament, and if I can recommend them something. I said, what is your opening repertoire? What would you like to play? And the answer in a lot of cases is the same. I like something very sharp. Now, if you choose sharp variation, sharp opening, sharp means that it's not sharp for one side only, then it's bad for that side. Sharp means double-edged. Double-edged means that one move, when it's double-edged and sharp, it means one move can be decisive for either side. So that's why sharp variations is very dangerous to play. You may be always one move away from winning or losing, and that's why those variations have to be you have to be very well prepared for them and know them very well. So let me give you a few examples how you can play sharp variations. And if you are not very well prepared, what can happen? I'm going to give you a couple of examples of total disaster. d4, knight f6, c4, c5, d5, b5. Now, who can play this opening? This is Benko Gambit with a pawn sacrifice on very early stage of the game, and obviously the person that can play this with black is someone who likes very sharp continuations. So c takes b and a6. Now, normal answer for white and most frequent is b takes a when white accepts the pawn sacrifice, but then black plays bishop takes a6 and it becomes relatively quiet game, not that sharp, where black has a long-term advantage on a queen side, and they have reasonably good play for a pawn. But there are a couple of other continuations. Another move is b6. And when white does not accept this pawn sacrifice, and now after queen takes b6 or e6 move that black can play, also reasonably quiet positions with okay chances for black. But suppose you play this Benko Gambit and someone you play this against and you like these sharp variations, but he likes it even more than you do. Then what you do? He goes knight c3, you play pawn takes pawn, and now he does not care about getting extra pawn. Now he goes e4, and after b4, he goes knight b5. Now what happens here that instead of you sacrificing pawn, he sacrifices pawn to you. And now what you're going to do? Now you have really an option to accept this pawn sacrifice on e4 or not. Well, the best move known in theory is d6. Now white goes knight f3. And suppose now you decide, you have to decide here what to do. Should you accept the pawn sac or not? And suppose you do. Now you're playing this sharp variation of Benko Gambit, so you expect to get active position. Instead, your opponent sacrifices pawn, and if you accept the sacrifice, you should expect yourself to do some defending. And after knight takes e4, and your opponent plays bishop c4, Now you're going to have a problem to deal with. How you're going to develop the king side and how you're going to castle. And interestingly enough, here, a few choices you have to make. It may be even too late already. E6 is not good because opening the position too quick. And if you want to go G6 with the idea to go bishop G7 and castle, looks like you're going to be okay. That's when you be paying the high price of being, you're going to get punished for playing very sharp variation without significant knowledge of it. So after G6, Queen E2, black has already made a mistake and black is already lost. There are other ways to play for black. This variation is okay, but not the way we see it now. And this happened, this was played by black on a relatively high level. And after knight f6, white plays bishop f4, and black is totally busted. Threat is knight takes d6, check. And how can you stop this threat? Maybe you can stop it by rook a6. And you know what? After you play rook a6 and you stop knight takes d6, the move white is going to make is knight takes d6. So practically you stopped nothing. And when you play rook takes d6 and white goes bishop b5 check, black is totally lost. They lose a lot of material. The quick example, if bishop d7, then bishop takes d6. You see the d file is blocked, and if black plays bishop takes bishop, then queen takes bishop with a check. And black is a lot of material down. In this position, actually, there is no more defense for black. If rook goes to d7, then bishop takes b8, followed by bishop takes d7 next move. In either case, black is going to be at least an exchange down. So you played sharp variation, and your opponent played sharp variation. When double-edged, this was double-edged sharp position. We are not going to go through all details of this sharp position, but this is one of very many examples of how can you get crushed in double-edged sharp positions if you don't know it well. I've heard many times, oh, I want to play. If this is this position, this variation of this opening sharp, yes. Okay, I like it, I'm going to play it. But if you don't know it well, you may get busted real quick. Now, let me show you one more variation. This is the opening theory. Knight c3, bishop b4, queen c2. This is one of the most popular, maybe the most popular move. Queen c2 is the most popular move of Nimzo-Indian defense. Now, on this queen c2, black has several relatively good moves. There is a castle is one of them, b6 is the other one, d5, c5, and so on, and knight c6. They are all acceptable moves. In most of the cases, white holds slight edge. But suppose you want very sharp variation because you are a very sharp player and you think that nobody can play sharp position as nearly as well as you do. Well, it's okay. We have a lot of players around like this. I was one of them years ago. It didn't take me too long to realize that I was wrong. So castle, pawn a3, bishop takes c3 check, queen takes c3. This is very popular position. What is so sharp about it? There's nothing very sharp about it. Sharp can start from this point. Normal move is d6 or b6. The very sharp move is b5. Now b5 is a real sharp move. I played it many times in my career, and actually I have done relatively well. But I'm not gonna try it again, because now when this is explored for white, I know my record is gonna change. So after b5, pawn takes b5. What is the idea of this pawn sacrifice? Now black goes c6, and if white accepts this pawn sacrifice, black plays knight takes c6, and black gets really good compensation for a pawn. Knight f3, maybe bishop a6, rook c8, and black gets a lot of pressure in the center. Well, there are ways to play this position for white, but if you think that you're going to get sharp position and double-edged position, if you get unclear and sharp position, that's good. That means your mission is accomplished. You got what you wanted. But let's go a little further. C takes b, c6, and now f3 move. Now this actually, you can try to play this opening for black. And but I have to enlighten you in a few areas of this opening. On move f3, I think black is doing well by playing knight to d5, attacking the queen, and now white must play queen d3. Queen c2 is not as good, because queen h4 check, followed by queen takes d4. On g3, queen takes d4. Black is doing fine. And if white goes queen d3, then f5. And black is doing fine again, because if b takes c, knight takes c6. Black is doing fine. They have good compensation. They have very quick development. Now we see the case that we saw before. The white's queen is out and no minor piece is out. And black has everything developed. It's worth a pawn. So this is a good position. So f3 is not such a good move. B takes c is not such a good move. And e3 is not such a good move, because pawn takes pawn. And if bishop takes, then bishop b7, attacking g2 pawn. And on knight f3, you can go either knight e4 and queen a5 check, or you can go knight c6 and rook c8. You have significant compensation. You can analyze it in more closely and in details. But move, I'm concerned about, and the reason why I stopped playing it, because when you play c6 and this pawn sacrifice, you expect to get very active position, and you don't mind sacrificing a pawn for it. But bishop g5 is the best move in this position, and after black plays c takes b, now white goes knight f3, and on d6 or bishop b7, white simply goes e3, and now pawn on b5 hanging. Now you don't want to sacrifice this pawn anymore, because knight cannot go to d5 or e4. And after a6, white goes bishop e2. And all of a sudden, you played very sharp variation, which is very sharp variation. But you don't want to play very sharp variation if your opponent can change the course of the game by making it very quiet position where you have significant disadvantage. That's exactly the case we have now. Bishop e2, now d6, white simply castles, and after knight d7, rook c1. White has two bishops. There is nothing sharp about this position, and white holds a small advantage because of two bishops, and there is nothing much happening for black here. So when you play sharp variations, the number one and golden rule here is consider all the options of your opponent. Make sure your opponent does not have, remember that your opponent may be playing very sharp, respond to sharp variation, and then you may get in trouble, or your opponent can just depart from the edgy variation to some quiet line, holding some positional advantage. This is exactly the case. So this is not the line that can be recommended, because white can get this position if they want to, and this is not a good position for black to play. So now let's go and look at some variation that years ago I was recommending this variation for black to play. I was recommending, and I really liked it, but I was recommending, and you cannot blame me if this variation is not good now, because there are millions of variations in a chess theory that have been updated and changed. The evaluation was changed, and this was just one of them. I am talking about Marozzi bind on my tape, accelerated Drakan Marozzi bind tape. One of the variations on recommend for black is knight c6, d4, cd, knight takes d4, g6, c4, bishop g7, bishop e3, knight f6, knight c3, knight g4, queen takes g4. This is very sharp variation. Queen d1, e5, and knight b5. This is all in the on my tape. And correctly, I suggested castle. This is all opening theory, but at some point, opening theory says that white has an advantage here. And I agree with it. But I departed from modern opening theory, and I invented new idea, which I liked, and I advised. And now, well, I shouldn't say I won't publicly apologize, because I don't want to do that, but I admit that variation that I suggested was incorrect. Okay, after castle, queen d2, here is my recommendation, queen h4, this is actually the theory, bishop d3, and now theory recommends d5, which we know it's not very good, but I recommended knight takes b5, pawn takes b5, and I recommended d5 move now, pawn takes d5, and f5 move now. And that's where my recommendation, actually it does not end here, because white castles, black plays f4, bishop c5, f3. And what I said on this tape, that black cannot take the rook, which is correct, because after queen g4 white gets mated, and g3, queen h3. And also I mentioned that after rook f to e1 or f to c1, black plays bishop h6, and on queen c2 f takes g, and taking rook is also bad because of bishop f4. That's also correct. This is also bad for white. But you see, the price of playing very sharp opening for one-sided, this is very sharp opening played for black, that it may be refuted. And if you have some positional, deep positional idea that is refuted, you may get to slightly inferior position or something. But when you have sharp tactical variation, and if it gets refuted, that means your history. So what I mean by that is that after black plays f4, bishop c5, black plays f3, and white plays rook f2 e1, just the way we played in a previous variation, and black goes bishop h6. Now, queen c2 move is already a mistake for white. White has basically two good continuations here. One of them is queen b4, but queen b4 is more or less okay for black to play against, but the move I am seriously worried about, and black seriously has a problem, is bishop to e3. This is the move I refer to the move that refutes whole variations for white. Now bishop takes e3, queen takes e3, and now you see that black does not really have decisive threats on the king side. For instance, on queen g4, white can simply go g3, and you see that any time queen will go to h3, bishop f1 will stop this mating threat. On the other hand, if black plays pawn takes g2, bishop e4 is very, very strong. White wants to take the g2 pawn with the bishop. White has an extra pawn and very powerful pawn on d6. This position I don't like for black, and you shouldn't like it either. So this is bad position. So we played very sharp variation for black. The chances are that your opponent, unless he already knows that this is bad, is not gonna find it on the board. But do you want to gamble? Do you want to gamble? And if you lose the gamble, so your opponent knows it or finds the correct continuation, then you gonna be very sorry you followed my advice. So it's just my duty that I have to warn you before it happens, that I have the alibi later. Okay, so now we're gonna go back, and I'm gonna show you another sharp and very, very sharp variation that can happen in Queen's Gambit decline, that can transpose to, actually it's a mix of Queen's Gambit declined and Slav defense. Here is what I'm talking about: d4, d5, c4, c6, knight f3, knight f6, and now we're going e3. What's the point of e3 move as opposed to knight c3 move? e3, the idea of e3 move here, I give you a quick update on this variation. So now if black goes e6, now we get from Slav defense we get the Queen's Gambit declined. The difference between this and very well-known position with knight on c3, that knight is still on b1. White delays development of the knight on b1, and there is a good reason behind it. Now white plays bishop d3. Now why do we delay development of knight on b1? I'm going to explain it. If we go knight c3, black is going to go knight d7, and after bishop d3 we have very well known variation of Meran in Slav defense. pawn takes c4, bishop takes c4, pawn b5, bishop d3, and pawn b4. You see, black has this tempo b4 in order to play c5 next. By holding knight on b1 and playing bishop d3, and black plays knight d7 and white castles. See the difference now? I played this position and my opponent took on c4. But my opponent played poorly this position and lost quick. White plays bishop takes c4, and now black goes b5, bishop d3, and you see that now b4, black does not have b4 attacking the knight on c3, because knight is not on c3. Now b4 is total waste of time. So black continues bishop b7, and now I went e4. Now in order for black to play c5, because this is the main idea of this opening for black, they have to protect the b5 pawn first. So he goes a6, and now I go e5 and knight d5, and I go knight c3. Now I go knight c3. After black already played a6 and wasted time he made another pawn move. As we know, time is very valuable in the opening. Pawn c5, and here white gets big advantage. Here it starts the sharp variation. Knight to g5. Now black is behind in development, and white takes advantage of immediate attack on black's king. There are various possibilities. This is very sharp variation, and if white knows it well, which I did because I developed it and I analyzed carefully before I played it, and I clearly benefited from it. So we saw what happens if when you play very sharp variation, and if you are not well prepared, and if variation is not good, you may pay the price for it. Well, this is another side of it. Now you're benefiting from it. Knight g5, and black has here number of continuations. Totally out of question is h6 move. That's one of the worst moves, because knight takes e6, pawn takes e6, queen h5 check, or even bishop g6 check. It gives a terrible position to black. Actually, the possible move as well is queen h5 right away, pinning the rook. Now if g6, simply queen h3. This is also very good for white, probably the best continuation, threatening knight takes e6. My opponent in this position did not find good continuation, and he got terrible position. What he did, c takes d. Let me quickly guide you to the position. Knight takes e6, pawn takes e6, now queen h5 check, king e7, knight takes d5. That's what happened in that game. Bishop takes d5, bishop g5 check, knight f6. Now white can take on f6 and get his piece back, but this knight is not going anywhere. White played f4, and I did not play the best moves, but I still won fairly easily. Now this is the bad way to play for black. There are other variations that I was prepared for, that are much, much sharper and more interesting. And we're going to go through this now, through them. Here is the position, and we just went knight to g5. And let's look at those variations. Those variations start with bishop e7 move. This is one of the ways to play bishop e7, and we're going to see what is going to happen here. On bishop e7, we go queen h5. We have to go queen h5. Now we're attacking f7 square. Pawn g6, queen h6. We have to. And now black is the one who has tactical shots here. Black plays knight takes c3, pawn takes c3, and knight takes e5. Now you can see the problem that white is facing. The bishop on d3 is on pre. If pawn takes knight, queen takes d3. We don't have queen g7 move because bishop f6 simply wins for black. So what do we have to do? We have no choice but take on e5. Queen takes d3. And you can see this is very sharp variation, and every move can be decisive for either side of it. Queen g7. Now we're threatening queen takes f7 pawn, and we're threatening queen takes rook. Black castles long. And now it's white's move. The best move in this position, queen takes f7. Knight takes f7 is not good because simply rook g8. So queen takes f7, and black is attacking bishop on e7, and bishop on e7, and pawn on e6. So best respond for black in this position is queen to d5. Black is threatening mate on g2, and white cannot play f3 because then black has very good position after either rook e8 or even bishop takes g5 followed by rook d7. This is very good position for black. So white has no choice but queen takes e6, queen takes e6, and knight takes e6. Now you can use this as part of your opening preparation and the variation you might play, because at this point when I analyzed it, I was kind of disappointed in white's position, because after rook d3 I don't like my position because pawn on c3 is hanging. I have an extra pawn, but black's bishops are very active, and I almost gave up on this variation because on bishop e3 my opponent plays rook takes c3, and on rook c1 he simply takes on c1 and plays c4. And understandably, I don't like this position. But then I noticed there is a hidden tactical shot, and in this position, when white goes bishop e3 and black takes on c3, and black has to take on c3 because right now the c5 pawn is hanging, and if for some reason black plays c4, then after bishop d4, white is simply winning. They are protecting both pawns. Then they play knight f4. They have extra pawn in better position. So rook takes c3 is practically forced, and now we have a shocking move. Bishop takes c5. Knight takes c5. And here, what may happen here? Obviously, rook takes c5 loses quickly because bishop takes c5, and rook c1. So black's move is in this position is bishop takes c5, And then white goes rook c1. Actually, you can play either rook on c1. And when white plays rook c1, and when black goes bishop b4, you have bishop d2 move. This is the move, that whole sharp variation that starts with knight from f3 to g5, based on, if white does not have bishop d2 move, knight f3 to g5 variation may not be a good variation. This variation gives white decisive advantage. Now, if white takes the rook, then rook takes rook, followed by bishop takes bishop on b4, because this is check. And black does not have any other move here, since rook is hanging. So whole variation favors white. Now, it's very difficult to find all of this for black, but black may find all of it while playing the game, because at some point they will enter the stage. They have to make only moves one by one, and like a blind man with a cane, they finally will get here. And when they get here, the bishop d2 is a big disappointment for them. You get winning position. Now, let's go back. There is, many years ago, I was very much interested in one sharp variation of Sicilian defense for black. Against Richter-Rauser variation, there is some very interesting variation for black. It's in e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6 or d6. It can be simple transposition. d4, c takes d, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, d6, bishop g5, e6, queen d2, bishop e7, white castles long, black castle short, f4, and this is the move. This is the very sharp move, e5. And I was very much interested. Now there is a lot of theory on it, but before theory was developed, the main move is knight f3. Was then. Now main move is knight f5. Okay, knight f3, bishop g4, h3, bishop takes f3, pawn takes f3. Now, let's talk about this position. Now, in this position, white has an open file, open g file, that can attack black's king. What does black have? You may say black does not have much here. They have bad bishop on e7. That's not so. Black has a lot here. Black has very powerful outpost for knight on d4. Black played knight d4. F takes e, and d takes e. And now white goes rook g1. Now here they are threatening bishop h6. So I went rook c8 and bishop h6. Now black goes g6. Now black has their own threats. Now after bishop takes f8 and bishop takes f8, this is fascinating position. White is lost here. Black has many threats. Queen a5, bishop b4, and white cannot move the knight from c3 because of possible rook c2 shot. And this position is very bad for white already. Actually, in the last move after bishop takes f8, black also could have played queen takes f8 or king takes f8. They are all good moves. Maybe queen takes f8 is the best, because now you're creating additional threat of knight takes f3, with a fork on a queen and the rook. This is a sharp variation, e5, and again, it's widely analyzed in modern theory. You can go, and there are a lot of interesting continuations there. It's a sharp, very sharp variation. But when you play it, remember, you have to know all the variations, because if you misplay it, again, I said it before and I'm saying now, if you misplay the sharp variations, there's no coming back from there. The game is over. So this is another example of this variation. Now what we're going to do, we're going to look at another very, very sharp variation that can be a disaster for either side if they are not well prepared. E4, C5. And you know, almost every variation in Sicilian is basically sharp variation, but some of them are sharper than others. Knight c6, d4, c takes d, knight takes d4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, bishop e3, knight f6, bishop c4. We already looked at one of the examples of this variation now, and we said that this is very sharp position. Maybe if black castles. Now we play queen a5 move in this position, the disabling white from castling queen side because e4 pawn is hanging. Well, now f3 move is a mistake because of tactical complications after queen b4, highly favorable for black. Quick example, queen b4, bishop b3, knight takes e4, knight takes c6. Now, if you are not well prepared here for white, you can really, for black, you can really get bad position. Knight takes c6, bishop takes c3, pawn takes c3, queen takes c3, king e2, pawn takes c6. Now, knight on e4 is not hanging, because if pawn takes e4, bishop g4 wins white queen. This is all known, and bishop d4 move looks like that wins for white, but this move loses for white. Now white attacks black's rook, black's queen, and the knight. Now black has absolutely fantastic move that protects everything and more. e5, attacking white bishop, and here is the choices white has. If white takes knight, black will take bishop. If white plays bishop takes c3, the knight will take on c3 with check, getting the queen back, and black ends up with 2 extra pawns. That's not acceptable either. This is bad. Now, and this variation was always known as bad variation for white. Now here is one very interesting resource for white, who is 2 pawns down, and if you don't know how to play against that, you may be in serious trouble. Move is queen to g1. Here is the idea of this move. White is threatening to take black's knight. If knight goes away, white wants to play bishop d4. Knight has to go away. Bishop to d4, and after queen a5, queen e3. Now let's see, what can white do here? What can black do? White is threatening bishop takes f6. I want to tell you that castling is very bad here because queen takes e7 and rook e8 loses to bishop takes f7, followed by bishop takes f6 check, and black is totally crushed. But if you know this variation, there is some well-hidden resource for black. It's a c5 move, attacking the bishop. Now, if bishop takes knight, looks like it's over for black. Rook is hanging, pawn is pinned, but here comes queen a6 check. And next move, black plays queen a6, takes on f6. And you see the position immediately turns and white is in serious trouble with a couple of pawns down. The correct move after c5, bishop takes c5, attacking e7 pawn, but then you again play bishop e6, and if bishop takes e6, again you play queen a6 check, and after king f2, queen takes e6 check, and finally position becomes quiet. It's quiet, but very bad for white. Black has an extra pawn with a positional advantage in the endgame. So this is bad for white. There are many variations in Sicilian that are extremely sharp. Now, if you play this variation, you have to make sure you know all ups and downs of it, because it's very easy to get in trouble. But it's also very beneficial if you know it very well and you know the final evaluation favors you. You can go there confidently and you can score a point. So that's the benefit. So that's the benefit of the good opening preparation and good studying of a theory. So I want to attract your attention to one more sharp variation of accelerated dragon. d4, cd, knight takes d4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, bishop e3, knight f6. And this is knight takes c6 variation. And after knight takes c6, b takes c, e5 and knight d5. Knight takes d5, c takes d, and queen takes d5. Now, this position is very, very well explored position. And I analyzed it on my accelerated dragon tape, and I recommended it for black after rook b8, and there are almost infinite variations here. However, after longer and more extensive analysis, I came to conclusion, and so is modern theory, that white still holds some advantage. So I wouldn't recommend that, and what I would recommend to play in this position, after b takes c and e5, here's the position. Knight g6 and bishop g7. We go bishop e3, knight f6, knight takes c6, pawn takes c6, and e5. Now, what I would recommend, though, is knight g8 move. Now, let me quickly run you through the variation. f4, knight h6, queen d2, castle, white castles, pawn d6, pawn takes d6, pawn takes d6. Now, winning this pawn on d6 is not very good, because queen takes and then knight f5. So the answer for white is h3 or bishop c4, and in all cases black has good position. My point I wanted to make is that sharp variation after knight d5 is not recommended. Knight d5 is not recommended. Knight g8 is. Now, again, to go all through this variation, it will be like an opening chapter, and we are not doing this. I'm saying how this is the sharp position and sharp variation, and they very frequently being updated, and so is this variation being updated. So as many of the other opening variations, this variation is not much different from them. So studying your opening repertoire and opening novelties is a lifelong process, and we have to be updated as innovations go, and do some researches on your own. That will help you a great deal. Thank you very much.